and welcome to another episode of Down to Disness, a monthly series where I pick a Disney animated movie and talk about its history and impact on pop culture. This month's movie is 1961's 101 Dalmatians. That's a lot of Dalmatians. Now, 101 Dalmatians was a very special movie in the history of Disney animation because it changed the way that Disney animators drew animated movies for decades to come, and it was a really big departure from the fairy tale fantasy type movies they had made previously. 101 Dalmatians came out right after Sleeping Beauty, which despite being very beautiful and wonderful, was a box office flop. So they were in need of a hit and money. Things were so desperate at the time that there was even talk of shutting down the animation department at Disney. Walt was very involved in live action, television, and of course, Disneyland, his theme park, and so a lot of people were like, why don't you just stop making animated movies for the time being because they're so expensive to make and you have so many other wonderful things happening. But of course, Walt would never stop making animated movies. They were his heart and soul, and he couldn't imagine just stopping that part of his company. Now, if you've watched my Jungle Book episode of Down to Disness, you've heard me talk about the Xerox form of animation that the Disney studio used during the 60s. 101 Dalmatians was the first Disney animated movie to make full use of the Xerox system. The first movie to actually truly use Xerox at all was actually Sleeping Beauty, when the animators used it somewhat secretly during the Maleficent dragon scenes. Xeroxing, famously, is a less expensive, less labor-intensive way to animate movies. And because production costs needed to be cut so much and remain low because the studio had no money, Xeroxing became a necessity for a movie like 101 Dalmatians. I'm sure a lot of you are curious what it really means, what the difference is between Xeroxing and hand-drawn, inked, and celled animation. So I'm gonna explain it to you, but it's kind of complicated. Previously, the animators would hand draw animation and then send those sketches to the ink and paint department. In ink and paint, separate artists would then trace over the animator's drawings onto a clear cell sheet, and then each different section of the character or scene would be filled in with paint. So it was a really, really labor-intensive and expensive process because you had so many people working on one animated character or scene at a time, and you had to draw everything twice or even more than twice for each cell of animation. Xeroxing involved using a copier machine, which would take a picture of a drawing, transfer the drawing to a plate, which was dipped in toner, and then transferred to a clear cell. One of Walt Disney's oldest friends and very first business partner, Ub Iwerks, was the one who realized that they could use Xeroxing for their animated movies. These big copier machines were available for purchase, but no one had been really using them for animation yet, and he wondered if they could be used for that purpose. Mind you, these copier machines are not like ones that you see in offices today. They were so big that they took up 3 rooms. The main difference between Xeroxed animated cells and hand-inked and paint cells is that the lines come out somewhat scratchier with Xeroxing, which is the style that you'll see from 101 Dalmatians through the 60s and 70s. There is still a ton of debate among animators whether Xeroxing was a step forward or a step backward for the history of animation. On the one hand, you lose some of the beauty of traditional animation, but on the other hand, the talent of the animators is able to show through because they're able to do more with animated characters because things are easier and faster to do. Specifically for a movie like 101 Dalmatians, Xeroxing was somewhat necessary because to do an animated feature that features thousands and thousands and thousands of spots, that kind of thing just can't be done with hands. So Xeroxing became the way to do things at the Disney studio basically all the way up until Rescuers Down Under, which is when, with the help of computers, they paired the concept of Xeroxing with the help of computers to create a more refined look like the classic movies had. The downside of moving to Xeroxing at the Disney studios was that so many ink and paint employees were fired. They went from about 500 employees in that department to under 100 to cut costs. So in terms of the history of animation, both at Disney and outside of Disney, they were the forerunners of the Xerox movement, and it just dictated the way that animated movies were made at Disney for so many years. But there is still so much to say about the story of 101 Dalmatians, so let's get into that. Author Dodie Smith wrote the story of 101 Dalmatians in 1956, and it was inspired by her own Dalmatian dogs, one of whom was actually named Pongo. Smith says that she had a friend who always said that her dogs would make beautiful fur coats. She didn't say it as maliciously as Cruella de Vil, but that is where the conflict of the story originated. When Walt Disney read Dodie Smith's story, he immediately snatched up the film rights, which is something that she apparently had always hoped he would do. Per usual, Disney did change a few aspects of the story. For one, the characters are named Pongo and Mrs. Pongo, or sometimes just Mrs. In the book, Roger and Anita's names are Mr. and Mrs. Dearly, and it's said that Walt changed the name because he already had too many characters that had somewhat similar names. Specifically, Jim Dear and Darling from Lady and the Tramp, and Mr. and Mrs. Darling from Peter Pan. This film marks the first time that a Disney animated movie was written by just one person, and it was Bill Peet that was put in charge of the story. Bill Peet worked really closely with Dodie Smith on the story, and in the end, Smith ended up saying that she believes Peet vastly improved on her original novel. Like I said, Walt was really busy with other endeavors at the time, like his live-action films and Disneyland, and so he really had little involvement in the writing of his animated stories, but he specifically thought that Bill Peet did such a good job with his original draft of 101 Dalmatians that he made almost zero edits and just let him go with it. As I mentioned, I think the other thing that 101 Dalmatians is famous for is just breaking away from the mold of type of movies that Disney had made in years previous to it. Disney, of course, is big on musicals, it's big on fairy tales, it's big on romance, and 101 Dalmatians focused on none of these. It's a movie with maybe the fewest songs of most Disney animated movies. It has about 2 songs. While it does have relationships between Roger and Anita and Pongo and Perdita, it doesn't really focus on romance as its core theme, and most importantly, it's not a fairy tale. If there's one thing that Disney historians and modern-day Disney filmmakers say about 101 Dalmatians is that it was so contemporary to the time it was made. Not only does it take place at the time that it was made in the early 60s, but it remains modern to this day when you watch it. Very different from even the movie that came right before it, Sleeping Beauty, which is such a fairy tale, the ultimate Disney fairy tale. One thing that I think aided in it feeling really modern was the fact that all of the car scenes, any car in the movie, was animated from live action film. So any scene with a car, for example Cruella de Vil's car, was taken from actual live action footage. They created every single car out of cardboard and would draw black lines along all of the edges. So when they filmed it, they could put it through their Xerox copier and create film cells from actual live action footage. A lot of Disney legends were still around to work on this film, namely Mark Davis, for whom this was his last animated project before he went over to Imagineering to work on Disneyland. Mark Davis did all of the animation for Cruella de Vil, whereas all the other characters were kind of a combined effort from multiple animators. It is said that Davis used famous actress Tallulah Bankhead as inspiration for Cruella's movements. Helene Stanley, as I've mentioned in other episodes of Down to Disness, was the live-action reference model for Anita, as she had done for Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty in their respective movies. Barbara Luddy, who was the voice of Lady in Lady and the Tramp and Merryweather in Sleeping Beauty, was the live-action reference model for Nanny. And Nanny kind of looks like Merryweather too. And speaking of Lady and the Tramp, there's actually quite a few cameos from characters in Lady and the Tramp in 101 Dalmatians. Biscotti Jacques is the first dog to respond to the Twilight bark. The Bulldog and Peg from Lady and the Tramp can be spotted in the pound in this quick scene, and in one very small part of the movie, Lady herself even comes onto the screen. Lucky for the Disney studio, 101 Dalmatians was a pretty good success. It ended up being the highest grossing film of 1961, and every time it's been re-released on DVD or Blu-ray, it has made them a ton of cash. 101 Dalmatians is a classic that remains contemporary to this day and continues to appeal to children who watch it every new year. Honestly, 101 Dalmatians' legacy is the history of Xerox animation at the Disney studio. Obviously, the story is classic and beloved enough to inspire multiple sequels and live-action adaptations, all of which are also wonderful. Who doesn't love cute puppies? That's the core of it. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Down to Disness. I hope you learned a ton of new things about 101 Dalmatians. As always, follow me on Twitter because I like to do polls right before I film Down to Disness on which movie I should do for that month. You guys all chose 101 Dalmatians, but other choices included Robin Hood and Oliver and Company, so if you think I should do one of those next, be sure to follow me on Twitter. The link is in the description box below. Of course, you can always leave a comment letting me know which movie you want me to do next, and maybe I will include it in the poll, so leave a comment down below letting me know if you learned anything, and also what movie you'd like to see for March. Thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you real soon. Bye!